Hello everyone, my name is Ian Lumsden. I'm a student at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and today I'll be presenting my work on enabling graph-based profiling analysis using Hatchet. During this work, I was mentored by Stephanie Brink, Mike Wyatt, and Todd Gamblin from Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and Michaela Talfer from the University of Tennessee. To start, I want to introduce some limitations of HPC-focused profilers, using HPCToolkit as an example. In the HPCToolkit workflow, you start with the application being profiled. You then run this application through the HPC Run and HPC Struct tools. HPC Run actually runs your program and collects raw performance data, such as timing data, and stores it in a call path profile. HPC Struct performs binary analysis of your application and generates a representation of all the caller-callee relationships in your program structure. Next, you pass these intermediate outputs into the HPC Prof or HPC Prof MPI tools. These tools merge the two intermediate outputs into an HPCToolkit database, which is the final output of the profiling. The final step in this workflow is analyzing and visualizing your data. This is usually done using the analysis tools HPC Viewer and HPC Trace Viewer, which are provided by the toolkit. In this workflow, and in fact in most HPC profiling workflows, the limitations of HPC profilers show up in the final profiling output and the visualization and analysis step. First, most HPC profilers use their own custom, unique data format for the final output. The use of a non-standard data format practically forces most users to analyze their data with the provided visualization and analysis tools, which are usually GUI-based and thus have limited analysis capabilities. So, together, these two limitations in HPC profilers limit user analysis options. Hatchet was developed at Lawrence Livermore to get around these limitations. It is a new general data analysis tool that can read HPC profiling data generated by different profilers. Once loaded, the data is separated into two parts. The raw numeric performance data is stored into a pandas data frame, while the caller-callee relational data is stored into a directed acyclic graph. These two pieces of data are then combined under Hatchet's primary Python object, the graph frame. Due to its ability to read in data from different profilers, plugging Hatchet into a profiling workflow is as simple as changing the analysis tool. For example, in the HPCToolkit workflow we looked at earlier, we simply replace HPC Viewer and HPC Trace Viewer with Hatchet. Once the data is read into a Hatchet graph frame, it can be analyzed using Hatchet's provided analysis capabilities, or it can be extracted from Hatchet and passed to other existing Python-based data analysis tools. However, Hatchet's analysis capabilities have an issue of their own. Although Hatchet can read both the raw performance data and the relational data, it restricts users to analysis of only the performance data. This is a problem because analysis of the relational data, which Hatchet does not support, is critical in performing in-depth analysis of performance and scalability bottlenecks in applications. So, in this work, I augmented Hatchet to enable the use of the caller-callee relational data in analysis. More specifically, I first designed a new graph-based filtering query language to enable the analysis of the relational data. Then, I implemented this query language and integrated it into Hatchet. Finally, I performed a case study in which I used my augmented version of Hatchet to analyze the performance of different MPI calls in MPI benchmark applications. Let's look at each of these contributions, starting with the design of the query language. The main purpose of the query language is to allow users to filter nodes in a graph using a user-provided path pattern, which I'll refer to as the query path. In other words, the query language allows users to perform relationship pattern matching on a graph frame. This relationship pattern, or query path, is represented as a list of abstract graph nodes. Each abstract node has two parts. First, there is the wildcard, which specifies the number of real graph nodes to match the abstract node. By default, the wildcard is 1. Second, there's the filter, which is used to determine if a real node matches the abstract node. By default, the filter is an always true callable. In other words, any real node will match an abstract node with a default filter. After being constructed, the query path is passed into the core algorithm of the query language, which at a high level is actually pretty simple. First, the user's input is parsed. Next, all nodes in the graph being filtered are matched to the abstract nodes of the query path. After that, all paths in the graph that match the entire query path are collected. And finally, a new graph frame is constructed that contains only the nodes and edges found in the collected paths. Now that we've covered the design of the query language, let's look at how it is integrated into Hatchet. In Hatchet, the query language has two API levels, a low level and a high level. In both levels, wildcards are represented by one of the following: dot, plus, star, or an integer. The meanings for these values, particularly the strings, are derived from standard regex syntax. So dot means match one node, plus means match one or more nodes, star means match 0 or more nodes, and an integer means match exactly that number of nodes. The first major difference between the two API levels is the representation of the filter. In the low-level API, the filter is represented by a Python callable that accepts a real node and returns a boolean. If the filter returns true, the real node matches the abstract node. In the high-level API, filters are represented by Python dictionaries keyed on node attributes. Node attributes are effectively the names of the columns in the internal pandas data frame. The values in a filter dictionary are the actual conditions defining the filter. The other main difference between the API levels is the interface, or the way in which abstract nodes are combined into a query path. In the low-level API, query path construction is done using chained function calls, with each call in the chain adding a node to the query path. In the high-level API, query path construction is done using built-in Python data types. So an abstract node becomes a tuple of a wildcard and a filter, and the entire query path is simply a list of abstract nodes. In both cases, the constructed query path is passed to the pre-existing GraphFrame filter function, which was previously used to filter nodes based only on the internal pandas data frame. Now that you have a sense of how the query language ties into Hatchet, let's look at a simple example of the language in action. In this example, we'll start with the following simple graph. In this graph, each node has two attributes, a name and a time, the latter of which is represented by the node's color. Now let's apply the following query. This query searches for all paths, starting with a node named solvers, directly followed by a node with a time less than 50, followed by 0 or more of any node. There is only one path in the original graph matching this query, so the returned graph is simply this path. Before moving on, I want to quickly mention that this query language is already publicly available, starting with the 1.2.0 release of Hatchet. Finally, after implementing this query language, I performed a case study to both show the new analysis capabilities the query language provides, and to locate potential root causes for performance differences in applications. More specifically, I examined the performance of the MVAPICH and Spectrum MPI libraries in the AMG 2013, KRIPKE, and LAMMPS benchmarks. I ran each of these benchmarks with both MPI libraries using 64, 128, 256, and 512 MPI ranks, and I profiled all of these runs using HPCToolkit. I performed all these runs on Lawrence Livermore's Lassen supercomputer. Once loading the HPCToolkit profiles into Hatchet, I used the following query language filter to extract subgraphs rooted at standard MPI calls. Next, I performed two types of analysis on the resulting data. For the sake of time, I'll be focusing only on the results for the AMG 2013 benchmark. First, I calculated the percentage of the total MPI time spent in each MPI function. In the following figures, the x-axis shows the number of MPI ranks, and the y-axis shows the percentage of the total time considered. Also on the x-axis, M stands for MVAPICH, and S stands for Spectrum MPI. At the tops of each bar, the total time considered is shown in seconds. In this specific figure, the total time considered is the total MPI time for the application. In AMG, the MPI allgather function is by far the largest contributor to the total MPI time, with most other functions providing relatively small impacts. Additionally, as shown by the numbers at the tops of the bars, the total MPI time for Spectrum is much larger than that of MVAPICH. Next, I calculated the percentage of the total MPI time spent in the child functions of the MPI function calls. In AMG, the most consistent contributor to the MPI time for both libraries was pthread spinlock, although there was also a significant contribution in Spectrum by the Mellanox user space InfiniBand driver, aka libmlx5. Finally, to identify more specific slowdown causes, I focused on the MPI allgather function in AMG 2013. There are two reasons for this. First, unlike the other benchmarks considered, there's a large difference in the total MPI times in Spectrum and MVAPICH. Second, in AMG, there is a disproportionately large contribution to the total MPI time provided by MPI allgather. To zoom into the allgather function, I used the query language to first obtain subgraphs rooted at MPI allgather calls. Then, using these subgraphs, I extracted the contributions of the child functions identified as most important in the figure on the left. The figure on the right shows the contributions of these important child functions towards MPI allgather. From this analysis, there are two main conclusions that can be derived. First, as shown in the left figure, the most consistent contributor to the MPI time for both libraries was pthread spinlock. Second, as shown in the right figure, the inferior performance of MPI allgather in Spectrum MPI can possibly be attributed to the use of pthread spinlock due to Spectrum using this function roughly 10% more than MVAPICH. Additionally, this case study illustrates the following new analysis capabilities that my query language has enabled in Hatchet. In the future, I intend to use and expand on the techniques and tools from this work to study large-scale scalability and replicability problems. I hope to use the information gained from these studies to propose mitigation strategies to the problems considered. I intend to develop additional tooling to help others study and mitigate these and similar problems. Thank you very much for your time. If you're interested in Hatchet, I would encourage you to check out the original Hatchet paper from SC19, our paper in the Pro Tools workshop here at SC20, and Hatchet's GitHub and Read the Docs pages.